Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started with today's webcast. My name is Alan Haupt with CA Technologies, and today's webcast, as you can see there, is entitled Get Optimal Value from CA Service Management's Change Management Capabilities. This is a session that we did at CA World, or I should say John Weston did at CA World just a couple weeks ago, that had some very high attendance, and we wanted to make sure you got value from this as well if you were unable to attend CA World. We this is a second webcast, community webcast in a series of 3 and maybe expanding to 4 that's focused on helping you get more value out of your CA service management investment, as well as driving maturity in ITSM. We had a focus in November on request management and service catalog, and we have a focus this month on change management, and next month on proactive ITSM, which is focused more on automation and integration. And we may be adding some more to the series as well. So the community webcasts are very focused on the products, as you'll see today, and there is also a parallel series that we're doing through our CA Service Management Insights Bright Talk channel, which are more thought leader webcasts, and those are in combination with Pink Elephant and CA. So we'll get started here. John Weston is a senior principal consultant with CA Technologies and an expert in this area, and I'm going to turn it over to him. And please ask questions, as Chris mentioned a little while ago, as we go through using that Q&A tab up at the top. So thank you, and we'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Alan. Real quick, folks will have a chance to download the presentation from CA World, I believe, right? I just want to make sure in advance, or at least view the recording of this presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, there's both will be available, John. Yeah, everyone there, this is being recorded, so this will be posted on the community under the, I think it's the Meet the Experts webcast series. You can go in there and watch this afterwards. There is also, if you want to get hold of the slide deck, there's a version of it that's available out on our CA World site under ca.com, but an easier way to get to that is I did a post, a CA World Service Management Roundup blog on the community just a couple days ago, and listed all the top attended sessions with the links to their PowerPoints, and this was one of them. So just go and look for the blog on CA World Roundup, and you'll find this PowerPoint there. So, thanks, John.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alan. The reason I bring that up is because there is a lot of material here, and I'll be going through it pretty quickly, especially with an eye toward that 4th agenda item, bringing things together, bringing a lot of the configuration management information that we have up front and bringing it together with change and release near the end. So I want to make sure that the presentation is available to everybody. Okay, so we'll start with configuration management, since this is extremely important to change management. Configuration management sort of undergirds a number of disciplines in IT service management, and certainly it does for change management. First, a couple of definitions. A service, the business service, is critically important to all sorts of areas in service management, and this is really any sort of deliverable that you have for your customers, wherever they may be, and around that deliverable, you will tend to have some set of expectations of availability or support levels, and certainly the service itself will be composed of configuration items, or CIs. These CIs are things within your infrastructure that provide services. So they're going to be things like servers, virtual machines, applications. They might be network devices. Even documentation can be considered a configuration item. All of these things together provide services. A management data repository, or MDR, is a system external to the configuration management data that can provide CI and CI relationship data to that configuration management data. So think of it as it's an external system that does its own thing. It has its own purpose for being deployed, but in addition to to its day job, essentially, it also can send its discovery data to the CMDB, the configuration management database, in order to either establish CIs, new CIs, or update existing ones. So some examples would be CCA, CA configuration automation, or a monitoring system, or an Excel spreadsheet for that matter. These all can be registered as MDRs within the system. This is important for, well, a number of areas that we'll see later, but primarily for reconciling incoming data and federating CMDB data from multiple discovery sources. Ultimately then, configuration management as a discipline is concerned with discovering and baselining configuration items and CI relationships, all with an eye toward establishing and maintaining service quality. There are a number of benefits. I won't go through each item on here, but from a change management perspective, one of the main benefits is assisting in impact analysis. That is, being able to start with a change order that has one or more CIs attached to it, and then being able to establish or investigate potential impact of the change. This is important because you may very well be introducing problems, unfortunately, into existing services when a change is implemented. It's possible. Or at the very least, during the time when these changes are going to be implemented, services and other CIs may be affected. This is a very common occurrence, and so being able to assess potential impact is a very important function of configuration management. Of course, it also provides other benefits to change management, such as being able to detect changes within the infrastructure through those MDRs, through those discovery tools, and others that you see here. But I am going to move on. I have some general guidelines for the configuration management database and establishing CI records, and then also guidelines around modeling services. First, in terms of the difference between a CI and an asset, is that usually an asset is more a function of dollar value. It's usually a physical item or a commercial off-the-shelf software asset, and there's some dollar value associated either with procuring it or maintaining it or licensing it or leasing it even. And there are all sorts of things like terms and conditions of contracts, supporting assets, and so forth. Configuration items, on the other hand, may be assets. Think of like a server, for example. A server will usually be both an asset and a CI, but the CI side of it is less concerned about dollar values and terms and conditions of contracts and so forth, and more concerned with how the entity is configured, how it is configured, and what other CIs it relates to. So one of the very good guidelines for determining whether something actually is a CI or not is whether it is subject to change management. This often comes up in conversations with customers, with my customers, where some shops will want to model almost everything within the infrastructure as a CI, all the way down to desktop systems and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that, but for certain other organizations, that would be overkill. They don't need to have full configuration management for desktop systems or network devices, for example. That's why one of the guidelines that I recommend, and it's an industry best practice actually, is that if the system is subject to change management, then it's a good sign that that's a CI. That third bullet point is a good guide or recommendation as well. First of all, you don't necessarily need to know everything about a configuration item in the CMDB. This is where those management data repositories come in and really fulfill a lot of good, I guess, is think of, again, of a server, or let's take an application actually. An application CI, a tool like CA configuration automation could easily discover hundreds or even thousands of attributes about that configuration item, about that application. It can be keeping track of every DLL file for a Windows application, every registry entry for a Windows application, or for Unix and Linux for that matter, other files. But all sorts of parameters, runtime variables, and so forth regarding that application But usually that level of detail is going to be complete overkill for the CMDB proper. Usually in the CMDB, the attributes that will be on the CI record will be those attributes that, again, may show up on a change order. If usually on a request for change, let's use an example of an operating system, that RFC, that request for change may be, update these dozen systems to Service Pack 4 of their operating system. It's highly unlikely that the request for change will list out every file that will be updated and every registry entry in the case of Windows, again, that will be updated by the Service Pack. That may be documented somewhere, but that's not something that the Change Advisory Board will be considering. How about this 117th DLL? Are we okay with this one? That level of detail is too high for the CMDB. So usually at the CMDB level, you'll be tracking things like version, like for physical CIs, things like storage space or serial number, things like that. And then the other recommendation there, the other sub-bullet point, is that you shouldn't feel that you need to model all of your CIs right away or all of your services right away. The configuration management project and the change management project together are a lot of work, right, to get that up and running. And the most success that I have seen people have with this is to start modestly and then build on top of that. And that's an important recommendation that I would have. Pick certain services, a handful of services that are important, particularly important, I should say, to your organization. Model those, and then add iteratively to that. Moving on. Speaking of services and modeling, there are different ways of actually determining what constitutes a service within your organization. And there are some good guidelines here as well. Who's consuming the service, for example? What do they need from it? What should be reported on for that service? As with a lot of things in IT, a good guideline for determining level of detail for really anything, but definitely for services, is to start at the end and work your way forward. Start at what you need to report on, and then determine your level of detail from that. It's by no means the all you need to consider, but it is a good place to start with. So let's look at some, well, actually, before I get to the examples, at the overall process of creating a service and modeling that service. As I said before, it's best to start modestly and then build from there. Identify a handful of services, either build them by hand or make use of the CI relationship discovery capabilities of a solution like CCA in order to build out most of that service, and then work with the teams who are going to help provide the service, fulfill it, but also the consumers in order to determine key attributes of the service. And then determine who should be able to access it and modify it. And of course, constantly work on this and improve it. And what you'll be doing while you're creating these first couple of services is you will also be hashing out what the processes will be, not just for creating services in the future, but for working with those other teams that you need to work with in order to design the services. You'll be figuring out what sorts of meetings you need to have with them, who the liaisons will be with from other departments for the service management project. Now, in terms of service modeling or service structure, there tends to be, well, there are a couple of different ways, and overall structures of services that I've seen, but the most common that I've seen is to approach things from kind of a service hierarchy perspective like this, where at the bottom you've got the actual infrastructure elements that are helping to provide the service. Up from there are some logical, a logical layer like for example, the applications that are hosted on that hardware. Up from there you may have a system layer, possibly a subservice, and then the service. At each layer you may have other other elements that at the same tier that are similar. So for example, at the physical host layer, you may have servers, but also network devices. For the subservice, what we mean by that service versus subservice is that often there are compelling reasons to have sort of a middle layer or an interim layer between the overall service definition and say the application that is using that or that is used by that service. For example, we may have a service called Acme, the Acme application. That application may be in production, but it may also, of course, be in development and test environment. You may want to model Acme as a service, in which case you'd have a service called the Acme service. But if you do have completely different infrastructure supporting production versus development versus test, then you may want to create a subservice for Acme production, Acme development, and Acme test. That's not a hard and fast rule by any means, but that is one way that you can go. And that's what the benefit that gives is it allows somebody to, if they need to, within Service Desk, view the entire Acme picture or narrow down to just one environment very easily. One other type of relationship that pops up in service modeling is peer-to-peer relationship. That is where there is no provider or dependent, and yet a relationship exists between these two CIs. Think of, for example, a failover server. You've got a primary server and its failover. There definitely is a relationship between those two, but it's not like if one goes down, the other one goes down necessarily, right? I mean, so it's not a provider dependent as such. When you are modeling those peer-to-peer relationships and dependencies, just keep an eye on how many or how far sideways, I guess, you can get from a given CI. The reason is that if you go crazy with that and model every possible relationship, no matter how tenuous, I guess I'd put it, you can end up with a map, a visualized map of the service and its related CIs that almost has too much detail to be useful. So that's another recommendation I would have. So for structuring your services, some guidelines that I have here are, first, select the structure. And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that hierarchical approach is the most common one that I see among our customers. But there are other ways of thinking about it. So like at the bottom left, for example, is a more flattened structure, but where the services themselves are associated with contracts. I mean, so like literally contracts. So this is more common with MSPs, managed service providers, or other situations where you have chargeable services, but it is definitely a way to go. Mostly what I see from folks, like I said, is that upper left. That's a very common IT service structure. Now, when you are building your services, by all means, feel free to add layers or take them away according to your requirements. This is not a science as such. It's going to have to match your requirements. And in fact, further to that, at any given layer, feel free to remove, not just add, nodes as well. And as I said before, it's great and ideal to start simple and then build on complexity from there. Usually if you try to define everything up front, the project just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and often will never seem to start. And then it's not giving you benefit, of course. So some CI relationship guidelines. Of course, the CIs themselves are useful even without relationships between them, because you can at the very least develop ticket history for a configuration item, and it will at least have some troubleshooting data of use to technicians. But it's with the relationships where it really starts to show its worth, because that's where you start being able to utilize the visualizer or utilize the Impact Explorer with change management. One of the relationships that, or sorry, the recommendations that I would have is to start with the out-of-the-box CI relationships. There are a lot of them in Service Desk Manager, and actually probably more than you will need to use. There are some very esoteric relationship types in there. Feel free to add to those or modify the out-of-the-box ones, but there are some really good ideas in there, so check them out. Also, for the visualizer itself, you can modify how it behaves, or mostly how it looks, in terms of or through administration. So things, very simple things like assigning different colors to different types of relationships is useful, or creating new visualizer filters to go along with the out-of-the-box one. These will really help quickly to convey information to a technician. So let's look at some examples of these different layers in service modeling. Keep in mind, by the way, that each of these layers, or each of the items in a layer, is subject to change management, ideally, as is the entire service. This is one of the main reasons why we're even building these models in the first place, is for change management. So when you're looking at these different layers, that bold question that I have on the lower right is quite important. Is a given potential CI actually a configuration item, or is it just an attribute of another configuration item? What I mean by that is, it's quite possible, and certainly a solution like CCA can do this. It's quite possible to treat a network card, a file, a volume, or other kind of, or the operating system of a server as discrete CIs. Each one of those could conceivably be a configuration item, as opposed to, or you can go another route where they are not separate CIs, they're just attributes of the server. So instead of having a server that runs a particular operating system CI, for example, you have a server, and that server has an operating system as an attribute. Again, this is not a science. There is no hard and fast rule on whether to model things as CIs or as attributes of CIs. The recommendation I would have is to stay as simple as you need. So a maximum level of complexity, or sorry, minimum level of complexity needed in order to provide the information you need from, like, reporting, for example. So it's an important aspect of it. The examples I would give for each of these example layers, so these are not just example CIs, but example layers as well, are up here on screen. So you can see, like, you've got the IT service. Below that, you might have a web tier with web servers. The application servers or applications, they're making use of databases, and operating systems are in there as well. And ultimately, you've got hardware, network layers, and so forth. All of these can be represented, of course, as CIs. And with CIs, you've got family and class, which is essentially sort of like category and subcategory of the configuration item. And this is another area where we have a lot of examples out of the box, but I would recommend that you take a look at modifying. You certainly use the ones that make sense, but feel free to modify those out-of-the-box families and classes or create new ones. This is another good slide. Well, I could dwell on this slide for a good long time, but I'm going to move on in order to leave time for Q&A as well. So for relationships, as I said, there are a lot of different types, but let me bring up my laser pointer. to show that, for example, a service, a business service may be used by a certain organization, or you might have another relationship called subscribes to, for example. That's completely okay. That a lot of your relationships are going to be things like runs or hosts or is used by. These are very common sorts of provider to dependent relationships. You'll also see some peer-to-peer relationships as well, especially like at the network tier. Actually, before I move on, real quick, last thing about the relationships are that the visualizer is probably the easiest and most informative kind of portal for viewing a service map, but you can also use the impact analysis tool on a change order in order to drill down, so purely for impact analysis, that's separate from the visualization tool. Both of those are quite useful, so I recommend checking them out. Okay. One last section before we get to the change management. This is important because the change management, the combination of change and configuration management is going to make use of updates from those management data repositories, those MDRs that we talked about earlier. And so we need a way of identifying rogue updates and rogue inserts, that is, updates to the CMDB, to a configuration item that are coming, or either coming in from external systems or are being entered manually within Service Desk Manager, but that are not associated with a change order. That's what we would consider to be a rogue insert or a rogue update. Also, we need to be able to identify potential duplicate CIs that are coming in from third-party or external discovery sources. So there's some concepts in the built-in configuration management aspect or functional area in Service Desk that are very germane to the topic. The first is what we call the transaction work area, or TWA. This is essentially a staging area for incoming CI and CI relationship transactions. The way this works is when you're importing CI updates from a solution like CCA or UIM or Spectrum or Microsoft SCCM for that matter, if you're utilizing the TWA, you import them into the TWA, into that staging area. At that point, you're able to modify by hand or through SQL queries the transactions before bringing them into the CMDB proper, but you're also able to run certain other checks, like an ambiguity check that I'll get to in just a second, in order to spot potential duplicates. So my recommendation is to definitely think about using that TWA for incoming CIs and CI relationships. The overall approach is you'll load into the TWA from these other sources, and then you'll load from the TWA to the CMDB. So it ends up being kind of a two-step process. A CI or CI relationship that's in the TWA could potentially be in there very briefly or for a decent amount of time, depending on your processes and depending on who you need to kind of bless that data before it can come in. One of the main reasons to use the TWA is to prevent creation of duplicate records. These CIs are going to be coming in from external sources, and different sources may provide different types of attributes or even different values for the same attributes. And so reconciliation is concerned with being able to deal with that. So for example, on these boxes on the right side of the screen here, we have 3 discovery sources, all bringing in something called server 1. One of the discovery tools doesn't have a MAC address listed for that server. The other 2 each have different MAC addresses. So what do we do with that, right? So what do we do if we've already imported the top box, that first entry, but now we're getting updates or potentially inserts from 2 other sources. Who wins? You know, what do we do with that data? That's where reconciliation comes in. And the CMDB has 3 reconciliation tiers or priorities. The first is going to be pretty uncommon. It's where if the discovery source already has a service desk UUID for that record, then that means that there has already been some bidirectional integration set up with that external source. So the service desk knows exactly which record this belongs to, so it updates the appropriate record. So there's no ambiguity there. It knows exactly which one to update. Next is you can register in MDR in Service Desk and then create what's called a federated asset ID to associate with CIs and with that MDR. This allows sort of like a trust system for data that's coming in from that discovery source. This would be more commonly used for things like integrations with CCA or again UIM or Spectrum, but you can create this sort of MDR and federated asset ID system for non-CA tools as well. Finally, there's the reconciliation attributes. These are, you know, kind of like if all else fails, we can fall back on certain attributes of the CIs, the incoming CIs themselves. And Service Desk uses a very simple set of rules for what should happen when a CI is coming in where one or more attributes of that transaction match an existing CI in the CMDB. So, for example, second from, or say, third from the bottom is a good example, where we have duplicate name and serial number and asset number and everything, but a new MAC address, a unique MAC address is in the incoming CI transaction. The system recognizes that if we get to these reconciliation rules as a duplicate, because the idea is that the MAC address, it may just be there's a new network card on that server, but everything else, the serial number and server name and asset number and so forth, already exists, so we're associating it with an existing CI. But you can see that with these rules, there could potentially be some examples of things that might slip through anyway and end up being duplicates, and that's one of the main uses for the transaction work area. The TWA also allows for what we call ambiguity checks. This is where the system can identify the potential that a CI transaction has for being a duplicate. And it does this through a very simple metric. When you run the command to generate an ambiguity index, it just assesses for any given CI how many attributes of that CI are shared by other CIs in the CMDB. So, for example, you might have well, the example I have here is a good one. Ambiguity index 2 means that there are 2 matching attributes in the CMDB, either from the same one single CI in the CMDB or one attribute from 2 different CIs. So it's not telling you why it's ambiguous. It's just giving you this overall score. And the idea here is to give identify things that ought to be looked at by a human being. You know, ought to be seen given the old eyeball test, right? The ones with the high scores are good things to check out. So the ambiguity rating is a very good aspect of the Service Desk CMDB. So for dealing with them, there are different ways of resolving them. One is to just say, oh, that actually isn't ambiguous. You know, it's a discrete CI, no problem there. Another is to inactivate the ambiguous CI, so remove it. But if it's a CI that is going to continue to come in from one or more MDRs and continue to come into the system as in this state as a potential duplicate, then one thing you can do is supersede the CI, and I'll get to that next. Another reason to supersede the CI is if you already if it came in and there's already a ticket history associated with the duplicate. With a superseded CI, actually a superseded CI has all of the searches and all of the activity against it pushed over to its superseding CI automatically. So let's say we have a server called server 1, and we have another server, a duplicate server, called server 1. So we supersede the duplicate over to the real server 1. If somebody does a search within the system for something called server 1, they're not going to see the duplicate. They'll just see the real one. But if there is a ticket history on that duplicate, so we didn't catch that it was a duplicate for maybe a week or two, and in that time there were already change orders logged against it, enough that we really don't want to just inactivate it. We need to deal with those tickets. Then those tickets get pushed to the real one as well. So there's a relationship there between the superseding and superseded CIs that the UI, that the application itself takes care of, so the users don't have to. So there are some recommendations here. I won't dwell too much on this for the superseding CIs, just that the main recommendation I would have here is there a ticket history already associated with the CI? If so, and it's a duplicate, then supersede it. Don't just delete it or inactivate it. Okay, so now let's get into combining change and configuration management. And one of the main ways that we do this, or actually before I get into the CACF, I should have established this earlier on. Change management, of course, is concerned with the management of updates to baselined or established configuration items and services within the infrastructure. The overall goals of change management are to create an audit trail for these updates, but also to reduce the impact of changes and make the implementation and fulfillment of changes more consistent and prevent problems from arising as a result of change management. We can help out with, or configuration management can help out in change management in a couple of spots in particular. The main area that we're going to see in the CMDB help out with is, well, even before a change is identified or a change order is requested, usually just at the analysis, the root cause analysis phase, that's where the CMDB is going to provide a lot of benefit. But definitely at the tail end of the process, when it's time to verify that a change has been implemented properly, that's where you're going to connect up again with configuration management. And certainly if you're going to have discovery sources feeding the CMDB, then those things will both be very important, as well as that detection of configuration error at the 12 o'clock position here. So one of the functions that's built into Service Desk that we introduced a little while ago, and that is quite powerful, is what's called the Configuration Audit and Control Facility, or the CACF. Essentially what the CACF does is it allows you to say that not only are we going to associate a configuration item with this change order, we're going to specify the attribute or attributes of that CI that are going to be updated by the change order. We're going to specify what the new value will be, and we're going to specify how that value should be verified. And so it's a level of formality that may be too formal for some customers, but the benefits are going to be that this helps with that identification of rogue updates and rogue inserts. So one of the problems that the industry has wrestled with for a long time is very simple. It's a very simple problem, but very simple to describe, tough to solve, is say a discovery tool like CCA discovers that with one of its scans, hey, this DLL file for this Windows application has been modified or updated. Was that authorized or not, right? Is it authorized or not? That's Easier said than done. Usually the discovery tool is not going to know. The actual, like whether a change order exists for that DLL file is something that, SCCM or CCA, they're not going to know those things. Those are more within the domain of the CMDB, of the service desk solution. And that's what this CACF is designed to help with. There are different types of folks who will use the CACF. There's the overall administrator who's going to define which CI attributes are going to be selectable within the CACF, and then also sort of policies around what to do. Well, first of all, verification policies, but also what to do with these rogue updates and rogue inserts. Certainly the change manager or change analyst is going to be concerned with actually designating which attributes are going to be updated on a particular change order. And the way this works is, let me start with an example. Let's say we're going to update an application from version 3 to version 4. Very simple. Without the CACF, the way this would work is you would have a change order, and that change order would have the application CI attached to it. And usually in the description of the request for change, or maybe in the associated notes, you would have update application so-and-so from version 3 to version 4 or something like that. And that's fine. I mean, and for many or maybe even most shops, that is a level of formality that is just fine. We go through the workflow of implementing or testing perhaps, and then implementing and reviewing the update from 3 to 4. And then maybe one of the last steps of the change order is that we update the CI for that application to reflect that it now is version 4. So that would be an overall process of change management. What this CACF would let us do is have the change owner say, okay, yeah, here's the application that's being updated. The attribute product version is being updated, and it's being updated to 4, and I'm going to specify that this needs to be updated via discovery, for example. What that verification method indicates is that the change will go through its normal phases for that, its normal workflow, but if a verification rule is in place, leveraging this verify on discovery that the change owner picked, then what that means is the change order will not be allowed to be considered completed until that attribute gets updated via discovery, and specifically gets updated to being a 4, not to some other value. So it lets the service management team really formalize that kind of post-implementation review that is part of change management. You can see in the third bullet point here, the verification policies can have essentially different outputs. You can say, yeah, okay, it was a proper update, so I allow this essentially as a policy, and therefore I'm going to update the change order, and the CI itself will now be updated via discovery. Or we're going to create an incident if the discovery brings back a value that isn't approved. In other words, that is a rogue update. Or you might even just flat out reject the update completely. As I say in the bottom bullet point here, the wiki has an extensive discussion on this topic of the CACF, and I really recommend checking it out because it has some really good information there. But some example policies would be, well, like this top one here, allow the update only if it matches the change specification. That's the one that I described, where based on the incoming update to the CI, the verification rules will either allow the update to the change order, close out the change order, or not, depending on what that value became. Another would be the second bullet point. Here we're saying, we're kind of flipping the script around a little bit. We're saying that if a human being, if a human operator closes out this change order, then that indicates that's good enough for us. We're saying that if a human being closes the change order, that indicates that the CI attribute got updated properly. So with that verification rule, then closing the change would automatically update the CI to reflect the new value. This is ideal if you don't have third-party or external discovery tools. If all of your updates to CIs and the CMDB are done manually, then this saves a step. You're basically saying, yeah, as a change owner, I checked it out. The application is now version 4. I'm closing the change. That would automatically update the CI. And there are a couple of others as well, like the accept the planned value here. That also, in other words, that updates the CI without necessarily closing the change. Now, where this all relates to release management is going to depend, well, first of all, on what even you mean by release management. So release management, technically from an ITIL perspective, is not necessarily associated only with applications, with software development. Release is essentially kind of almost like a phase of change management. It's when you actually deploy the proposed changes is one way of looking at releases. In my experience with customers, release management is usually associated with software development or push, or at the very least, patch management of existing CIs. Where this can help, though, and some recommendations that we would have are certainly to tie together the change management and configuration management with your release management. And usually where the release management will come into play, again, is going to vary. If we're talking about software development, then probably you have literally a software development tool for which you need to set up an integration with Service Desk. This is quite common. I mean, from using our own software change management tools like Harvest, for example, or Endeavor, or our Agile tools, or third-party Agile tools. So Agile Central, for example, is something where the release aspect can be spawned via integration. Most likely, the integration method will be through process automation, the CA process automation. In other words, you have a change order that gets to a certain state, the state of being approved, all the testing work done, and all of the backup plan has been created. All of that pre-work has been done. Now it's time to actually implement. That's where that handoff to release management might occur. And then that release management handoff takes the form of a spawned process and CA process automation, which then creates activity in the release management tool. So this is where I'm getting into this first bullet point here, where an approved change becomes the kind of that handoff to the release. Not just an approved change, though. I would recommend things like a scheduled change. If it's been scheduled, if testing has been done, and all those other steps that may have to go with the handoff, not just approval. But certainly approval would be a necessary condition of sending this over to release management. Releases are also very important for just scheduling of changes, and this bridges both, I guess, worlds of release management, so development and patch management, but also just general purpose release management. And that is that quite often you're going to stage deployment or fulfillment of change orders into release packages. These packages can be scheduled, that you might articulate the release as a change all by itself. So it's a change order within Service Desk, and it has all of the kind of actual change orders as child changes. So this allows you to have a parent-child relationship between the release and all of the changes that are going to be part of that package. The benefit here is that it makes it quite simple to, within the change calendar in Service Desk, to view, say, only release packages, so only show me releases. This would allow that change calendar to have a much simpler view. If each of your releases has, say, hundreds of change orders associated with it, then that change calendar can look kind of cluttered pretty quickly unless you're filtering it somehow. So the releases can help with that a lot. Also, releases as a kind of a separate tier within change management can also help with things like SLAs and approvals. There may be an individual or a separate approval for each change order that's part of a release, and then a final go-ahead approval as well for the entire release. And so release and deployment management, that is the, I guess the overall discipline of release management, but then also this ties into the development and patch management as well. Again, this covers both, or both domains, I guess. They just at a high level, they have certain values. The first is just consistency and speed of delivery of the changes, but then also to reduce the risk by building an audit trail, but also by enforcing certain policies that you have. And actually, just in the interest of time, I think I have a couple more slides after this, so I'll jump through this pretty quickly. But obviously, we've already covered this, where your CIs can be covered by configuration management. So the overall picture here is that when building out your configuration management, you're going to start with identifying those services, identifying the baselining of those configuration items, and then providing a mechanism there in that middle tier of this diagram for updating those CIs via change management. This is also where release management would come into play, is in that middle tier there. This is where you are iteratively updating and modifying CIs according to your requirements, either as identified through troubleshooting or just ongoing development of your services. Ultimately, this data is all going to be reported on, and that can be done through the discovery tools, through those management data repositories, or through the CMDB itself. And then finally, all of this is subject to audit and verification within the system because it's all being logged. And that is it. So I'm going to pause my sharing in order to look at the WebEx notes and see if any questions have come in. So here, let's see. Or rather, I need to open up the Q&A tab. Okay, so one question is, we'll be able to send out the deck. I think this was answered at the beginning. Oh, go bigger. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, you did. Okay, you covered it. Next question. One of the problems with the TWA is that a configuration manager can't trigger a start from the GUI. You need a server admin to execute the GR loader. Yeah, that's true. The GR loader command is definitely an aspect of importing CIs into the CMDB, straight into the CMDB or into the TWA. So I would say that's not strictly a problem with the TWA, because even if you weren't using the TWA, you'd be using that GR loader in order to import it. What the TWA adds is that a non-admin user, so just a configuration analyst, I guess, they can still modify the data through the TWA interface. So you might make it so that, sure, the GR loader is something that only maybe configuration administrators or the overall administrator of service desk are able to use, but other users with the appropriate permissions can at least run those ambiguity checks and modify CI records that are in the TWA and flag a particular transaction as being okay to be imported and so forth. So you're still giving them the control to determine what comes out of the TWA into the CMDB without necessarily requiring that they be the ones to run the GR loader. Let's see. Question for when you're able, what do you say to only wanting to manage discoverable attributes? So major downsides. Also, with more and more going to the cloud, how do you manage cloud-hosted services? Okay, so the first question is only wanting to manage discoverable attributes. I mean, that makes sense. I would say that usually there are going to be some attributes of a CI or a service that just inherently are not discoverable. Think of like a server where you have something like the physical location of the server, like the fact that this server resides in room 123, on the 5th floor, something like that. That might be an attribute of the server that you do want to track, its physical location, but it's not inherently discoverable. And then at a service level, there are also going to be non-discoverable attributes usually. Almost, by definition, the connection point between the service and, say, the applications that are important to the service, those links are going to be built by hand. The fact that we have discovered the Acme application and all of the CIs that support it, that can all be done via discovery, but then why is that Acme application important? It's because we have this service called Acme, and it's subscribed to by these 4 organizations internally. Those are going to be generally non-discoverable attributes of the service. So definitely I'd say that there are going to be some things that you want to track that are non-discoverable. Of course, the downside to that is, management of those attributes. Somebody has to create them and maintain them. Now, in terms of cloud-hosted services, definitely you can model those in the CMDB. There's no problem with that. Now, your ability to discover those systems via automated discovery tools like CCA will vary depending on the service, right? Definitely CA configuration automation, for example, and I believe UIM both can discover cloud systems. There's no problem there. They're just CIs and services like anything else. So you shouldn't necessarily have problems with that. It kind of does depend on the application or the service in question, though, in terms of how that will work. We definitely do see more and more of our customers leveraging cloud systems, though, of course, either as development platforms or just as SaaS, applications. Let's see. Are you planning on expanding the change detection? If we have a change that collided with something higher in the stack, will the system indicate that there are already a planned change higher in the system? That's a great question. I don't know of something quite like that. One thing that the system already does do, though, is in Service Desk Manager, when you have a change against a particular CI, when it comes to scheduling that change, the Service Desk will automatically look for any services that depend upon that change, and it's going to show those services in the visualizer. Check that out. So when you schedule it, say you have a server that's hosting an application that's required by a service, just create a little test change order and then schedule it. And you'll notice when you click on the View Scheduler button that the scheduler will show not just the server and its availability essentially, but also the service or services that ultimately depend on that server. It's a really cool aspect of Service Desk, actually. But that is it's looking at services. It's not looking at whether there are changes to CIs that are possibly related. That's where that impact analysis tool comes in. So I would recommend checking out impact analysis as well, which is viewable on the change order. There's an impact analysis button. Let's see. Oh, we are right at the top of the hour. Let's see. Let me see if there are any other cues that I can A. I think that's it.
I think you hit them all, John.
Yeah, so thank you guys for your time, and certainly check out the presentation through the link that Chris sent out, and good change management and configuration management to you, and see you on the CA community. And other than that, I'll hand it back over to you, Alan.
All right, thank you, John. Thanks very much. Some great stuff communicated there. Just wanted to remind you the PowerPoint is out on a blog in the CA World, the CA Service Management community called the Service Management Roundup, CA World Service Management Roundup. So check out that so you can get a copy of the presentation there. We have a couple more sessions coming in the next month or so in this maturity, ITSM Maturity and Value Series. Again, there's one on the 10th of January. That is a Bright Talk webcast with Pink Elephant focused on proactive ITSM, and then we'll follow that up with a community webcast on a similar topic that's very much product focused, and then we'll have more information on future webcasts in this series. So stay tuned for them. Watch for the blogs and the discussions that I post out on the web and Chris puts out there in the scheduled in the Meet the Experts webcasts, and you'll be on top of these. So thanks for attending today, and hope to have you on a future webcast. Thanks again, John.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.